worked with you on a project. From today, I'm taking over as ABRA's executive director, a position which was previously held by my good friend and mentor, Rick Webb, who joins us today. Lou Freeman, our co-founder and former executive director, also joins us. He was the one who led us through the 6-year fight against the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. The highlight of our time today will be a discussion by Jonathan Mingle of his recently published book, Gaslight, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the Fight for America's Energy Future. John has brought us a new perspective on the ACP fight and includes a lot of other great information on how natural gas came to be so revered by policymakers and how energy markets operate, or don't, in the interest of all of us. The format of today's webinar will be a 15 to 20-minute discussion of the book by John, a 30-minute discussion by our panel, and about 15 minutes for questions. Now, there are supposed to be 100 people on the webinar today, so please keep yourselves muted during the discussion and the question and answer period, unless you're asking a question. If you want to ask a question, please put it in the chat or raise your hand. Hopefully, Zoom will recognize that. One last point to make, Island Press is offering a 30% discount on Gaslight using the code WEBINAR from Island Press. I believe that has been placed in the chat as well, a link to that. Now, I'll turn it over to Lou Freeman, who spent some time with John during the research and writing of his book, to give you a little more perspective on the book and the author. Lou? Lou, I think you're muted. We cannot hear you.
All right. I'm pleased to introduce John Mingle, who I got to know as he did research for this book. John has a Bachelor's of Art in Philosophy from Dartmouth College, a BS in Environment and Resources from University of California in Berkeley, and since then has been a freelance environmental journalist. You can read him regularly in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, and many other publications. Prior to writing this book, he wrote another book that a lot of people don't know about, but I highly commend to you. It's called Fire and Ice. Mm-hmm. And Fire and Ice is a fascinating book about the villages in the Himalayas that are being decimated by the receding glaciers, in part caused by black carbon pollution. And if you've started to read Gaslight and find out what a wonderful writer he is, you will be in for a real treat to read Fire and Ice. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lou. Wow. Thank you for plugging my almost 10-year-old book. I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you everyone for inviting me to talk about the latest book. And you know, it wouldn't exist without all the conversations that you and many others had with me over the years. I started reporting this book in 2019, so pretty late in the fight, you know, for you all, but that was when I first showed up and started pestering all kinds of people from Highland County all the way through Buckingham County to talk to me about their experiences and what motivated them to fight this pipeline. Yeah, it wouldn't exist without, you know, people's generosity with their time and their stories. I thought maybe, you know, in the 15 minutes I have, I would talk a little bit about I'll frame this via the challenges for me as a writer coming to a project like this. And I will use those 3 challenges I'm going to lay out as a way of reflecting back to you who lived this fight, what I heard from my many conversations with folks from, you know, West Virginia through Central Virginia. So I should just add that my book, the story really focuses on 4 counties, Highland, Augusta, Nelson County, Buckingham County in Virginia, with a little bit about West Virginia as well. But obviously the Atlantic Coast Pipeline was a 600-mile long project, and this book would have been way too long if I tried to wrap my arms around the whole thing. So I decided to focus on that terrain, physical and human terrain. And you know, after I did a bunch of reporting and I come back to this cabin in Vermont and try to figure out what to do with all the transcripts and the notes and the photos of steep slopes that Rick Webb hauled me up, you know, on the West Virginia border. I discovered that the first challenge, and maybe the most important one, is figuring out where to start. And as a writer, I'm a big believer that your lead, whether you're writing an 800-word opinion essay or a 4,000-word magazine piece or a 100,000-word book, your lead, your beginning is the most important part. And so, you know, I would estimate I spent at least a third of my time, you know, writing, just rewriting the first chapter or two, just trying to figure out where to begin. And the reason I think that's so important is that the lead should hold everything in the story encapsulated in the lead. It kind of signals where you're going. It gives the reader like a roadmap. And after many false starts, I decided to start the book towards the end in 2020, oral arguments at the Supreme Court about the Appalachian Trail, crossing the Appalachian Trail case many of you are familiar with. And the reason I did that is I wanted to signal to a reader who has zero familiarity with natural gas pipelines, gas regulations, you know, any of the stuff that was probably obscure to most of you in 2014 when you first learned about this project. I wanted to signal the stakes, right? Supreme Court equals important. You should pay attention to this. But then I immediately jumped back to 2014 because similarly, when you're writing a book, you know, the lead should signal where you're going. It turns out that when I reviewed my mountain of notes and tried to make sense of it all, try to find a path through it to help the reader, I discovered that 2014, 2015, those early days of the pipeline fight, based on what people told me, really held the seeds of what would come later. And of course, it's easy to impose a narrative in retrospect on the chaos of lived events, but that's really kind of how I saw it when I was looking through the transcripts of all the interviews I did and the documents, and the very helpful chronicle that Lou compiled of, you know, from 2014 through 2020, that I consulted a lot. And so I jumped back to 2014 for a few reasons. One was it's always easier to write chronologically. Like I think most people, it's just, as a reader, it's easier to follow a chronology. It's just kind of how we're used to interpreting sense data coming at us. But the other reason was that Nancy Sorrells, who you all, many of you, most of you probably know from Augusta County, key figure in, maybe she's on the call, I don't know, but key figure in the pipeline fight, had held on to this flyer that Dominion Energy mailed out to communities along the route in the fall of 2014. And the flyer said, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline will change everything and nothing. And then on the back, they had all these myths they wanted to debunk, myths about natural gas and its climate impacts, and would the pipeline be visible, and what will it do to your well water, and, you know, all these concerns that people had started voicing at meetings along the route already by the fall of 2014. And the last few words of that flyer, when I saw them, I had a real aha moment. And again, remember, I'm looking for a roadmap myself in terms of creating a narrative. And when I read these words, it really felt like something was unlocked for me. And those 5 words came after a bit where the Dominion's flyer explained that you wouldn't see the pipeline, it's invisible, it's underground, and there are far more miles of highways in Virginia. There are more miles of gas pipelines buried in Virginia than highway miles. And the last 5 words were very few people ever notice, right? it'd be easy to skip past that. They're trying to soothe people's fears. Many fears that had already bubbled up about what would happen to water quality, the karst terrain, steep slopes, species habitat, sensitive habitat, crossing public lands, national forests, Blue Ridge Parkway, Appalachian Trail, all this stuff. By the fall of 2014, it already really emerged. And this was Dominion's attempt to kind of allay people's fears. And the reason I really focused on that is because it became a Rosetta Stone for me as I tried to piece together this story. I really do think Dominion assumed that very few people would notice. Very few people would notice the damage, what's involved during the construction of a 42-inch gas pipeline across some of the steepest terrain in Appalachia. And they thought very few people would notice how these things get reviewed by regulators and approved, because that's historically how it had gone. And one way to read this book is to read it as the story of ordinary folks, again, in these 4 counties I focus on in Virginia, but also part of West Virginia, doing the regulators' jobs for them, forcing scrutiny upon this project that was being advanced by companies that really were assuming it wouldn't get a lot of scrutiny. They assumed that the thousands of pages of agency reviews by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, all the alphabet soup of all these agencies, state and federal agencies, you show the pile of paper produced, and that would suffice in a lot of people's minds as scrutiny, even though a lot of that stuff is copy and pasted, the environmental reviews from one pipeline approval to another. And so that really helped me understand what I was working with. And, just to go back, to those early days, fall 2014. Okay, so the first challenge for me is how to start the book. And once I'd figured that out, another challenge is the action of this book, much like the action of the folks on this call and in other communities who organized to fight this project. There's a bunch of meetings, really. And so I was confronted with this challenge of how do I dramatize Board of Zoning Appeals meetings, County Board of Supervisors meetings, FERC hearings, Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals arguments, people just sitting in a public library batting ideas around, trying to figure out how to, fight one of the biggest, most powerful energy companies in America. And so, I don't know if I pulled it off. I don't know if I succeeded in imparting a sense of suspense and momentum to what is essentially a series of whether folks talking at their kitchen table or meeting in the Stanton Public Library or going to rallies. But that was the challenge. And here again, fall of 2014 had a lot of what I needed to show the reader, here's what these folks who were confronted with this project landed in their lap in their communities. You get this letter if you're a landowner, or if you're Rick Webb, you go to check your mail in Monterey and someone says, hey, have you heard about the pipeline? And you start trying to chase down a low resolution map of the route and figure out what's going on. I wanted to show people what it's like to be thrown into that situation and not have a lot of information. And what do you do? What do you do next? Where do you go for information? Who do you talk to? And, so a lot of the key moments in the book, and especially the first part of the book, became these meetings where people are either behind the scenes or in public fora at, the meetings that boards of supervisors hosted, where Dominion would come and present their kind of pitch for why this will be a good thing for you, Augusta County. I wanted to show people pushing back on what seemed like an inevitable project because it's backed by Dominion, which everybody in Virginia, at least, if not here in Vermont, is intimately familiar with Dominion's influence and resources. What does that look like to start figuring out how you can even go toe to toe with a company like Dominion? And so what I wound up doing was kind of toggling between perspectives and moments of a dozen or more different characters, right? So here was another challenge, how to stitch a group portrait, right? There's not one protagonist or even two or three. There are many of them, thousands in reality, although I could only fit, 12 to 15 between the covers of my book to keep it a reasonable length. But that became a real challenge for me too. And what I wound up doing was stitching together these scenes where, for instance, Rick, you were presenting early, I think August 2014 with Greg Bupert in Highland County to a bunch of concerned citizens, trying to tell folks what you figured out from looking already at other pipeline case studies, and what you had already perceived as a pattern in terms of regulators saying, hey, it looks okay to us, go ahead and do what you want. And starting to anticipate both some of the challenges and opportunities that you would have as folks mobilizing against this project. And then over in Nelson County, a woman named Vicki Wheaton had been for years pushing to update floodplain ordinances, worried about what would happen during severe storms and floods if this pipeline is buried under dozens of stream and river crossings in Nelson County. Nancy Sorrells turning out 300 people to a Board of Zoning Appeals meeting where the Augusta County officials voted against Dominion's proposal to put a pipe yard in an area that was zoned for agriculture. And she gets people out, documenting floods that happened, knee-deep waters, and they upload it on thumb drives and give it to the folks on the board, and they voted it down. And that became the first time that Dominion heard no from an official body along the route of the pipeline. So these were the kinds of things I wanted to stitch together into a portrait of what does it look like when people start at their kitchen table and then meet in libraries and meet on Zoom and then go to court hearings and start to realize they have more agency than they may have thought at the outset. And that was also true, in Buckingham County, right? I have a whole chapter about what happened with Union Hill, where they wanted to build the compressor station for the pipeline in the midst of historic, predominantly African-American community. And that community had to organize themselves to do a survey door to door to document who lived there, and to show both state regulators and ultimately federal judges who ruled in their favor, vacating the air quality permit to build that compressor station. They took it upon themselves. They said, okay, state of Virginia, you're not going to do the work. We'll do it. And so that's just a theme that came up again and again in the stories that I heard from people and started stitching together into the book. And I could cite many more, right? I could point to obviously the work that the Pipeline Air Force and CSI initiative, where people are just, going out to document violations, either flying over, using drones, walking to the route, taking pictures, and reporting them to the regulators who were kind of asleep at the switch. And as a writer, I'm fascinated by what motivates people like that, what motivates people to, people with busy lives, people with jobs and kids and other responsibilities, to dedicate their free time and also some of their working time or their retirement to go that extra mile. I think a lot of people, as I was writing it, I imagined a lot of readers being like, yeah, I'm interested in that too. What explains that? And so what I'll do is I'll just close by reflecting back to you from all the conversations that I had, kind of three, what I call like superpowers that people discovered in the course of fighting this project that, again, are only maybe clear in retrospect. While you're living through it, you can't really perceive it that clearly, or maybe you could. Actually, maybe Ernie Reed, who I think is on this call, could, because there was a meeting that I write about early in the book in Nelson County, where, and this gets back to this idea that like your beginning has the seeds of all that will follow in terms of the story. I think this was true in terms of the fight itself. Ernie Reed is at the head of a group of folks, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ernie, if you're on here, and is trying to help people who are very, you could sense the anxiety in the room. I watched a video of it. I wasn't there. But there's a lot of angst and people just hungry for information. And he says the best thing you can do right now, aside from returning a letter if you're on the route saying you don't want surveyors on your property, is talk to your neighbors, right? See what they're thinking and doing. The more we talk to each other, the stronger we'll be. He also said that I think we will wind up being more of an obstacle to Dominion's plans than the federal agencies will. And that proved to be prophetic, really. And, you know, in that moment, I think these superpowers that I'm about to tell you about before I stop talking are becoming apparent. And one of them is overcoming a sense of isolation. I think early on, a lot of people I talked to, especially landowners, but, you know, even folks who didn't live on the route, but didn't want this in their community or didn't think this was in the public interest, period, which we could talk about in the Q&A if we have time. But it's easy to feel overwhelmed and isolated, and that is also part of the pipeline developer strategy. They don't necessarily want you sharing information. And so you have to get over that. And how do you do that? You talk to your neighbor, you knock on their door, you organize meetings in the public library, you discover your neighbor is a wizard at GIS mapping or operating drones or mapping karst sinkholes or whatever it might be. And you start to get a sense of like this diverse skill set that your community possesses, in addition to intimate knowledge of the place and what makes it worth protecting. The second superpower, which I think is captured in this moment, is overcoming a sense of fatalism, right? An inevitability that this future has been written. This project will get built, which I know a lot of you all heard from well-meaning neighbors. You know, I heard many people tell me in many different communities, oh, people would tell me like, I support what you're doing, but you're wasting your time. This will get built. Did not get built, right? And I think key to that outcome was early on overcoming a sense of this is inevitable, you know, signing those email newsletters. This is not a done deal. When you're communicating with each other, that is an enormously powerful thing that, to me, as someone who hears this from lots of folks I talk to, really leapt out at me. Once you get a sense that maybe you have some leverage and agency and power to shape outcomes, there's a snowball quality to that. And the third superpower is, it seemed to me that pretty early in the process, the pipeline fight, people are pushing on different doors, trying to talk to local legislators, local officials, state regulators, go to FERC, meet with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commissioners in DC, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, whatever. You're putting public comments into the FERC docket, excuse me, and very quickly realizing that, you know, those avenues might not be that helpful. And there was a letter that was written, and then I'll just end with this, by an Augusta County resident right after one of the early Board of Supervisors meetings, August 2014. And he writes to the Stanton News Leader, the idea that this matter will be decided by the federal government is wrong. This will be determined by whichever side, the citizens of Virginia, or Dominion Energy puts the greatest effort into the fight. And again, that was a prophetic statement, I think, and why I quoted it early in the book. Recognizing that this fight was about power, about taking power back from an enormously powerful corporation to, multiple corporations, Duke Energy too, and that it was about accountability. So again, forcing scrutiny. Very few people ever notice. What I heard from talking to folks was a story of people taking it upon themselves to apply that scrutiny that they saw that they're, the stewards of the public interest at the federal level, state level, were not applying, right? And they did it, they persisted until they won. And the reason I thought that was worth, a book rather than just a magazine story, is that doesn't happen very often, right? So there were many lessons, and I just scratched the surface because I don't want to take up any more time, but I thought those were lessons worth a wider hearing, and that is why I decided to write Gaslight.
Thank you so much, John. It's hard to really gain a perspective, having been part of it for so long and lived it kind of every day for 6 years. I think a lot of us patted ourselves on the back and said, yeah, right on, we got it done, and never really thought about necessarily how. We all had superpowers. I'm going to break out my cape here in just a couple minutes after the panel is done.
Turns out, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, next up, we have a brief panel discussion about the book, the fight, what's happened since, where things are headed, and just what everyone's thoughts are about John's discussion. On our panel today, we've got Lou Freeman, co-founder and former executive director of Allegheny-Blue Ridge Alliance, Rick Webb, retired environmental scientist from the University of Virginia and former executive director and current board member of ABRA, Kent Carricker, a retired ecosystem specialist from the U.S. Forest Service and former board member of the West Virginia Highlands Conservancy, Ernie Reed, who currently serves on the Nelson County Board of Supervisors and was one of the primary leaders of the community resistance that rose up against Dominion's project, and David Sly. Dave is the conservation director at Wild Virginia, is a board member of ABRA, and is knowledgeable about what is currently going on with the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which is something we don't want to forget. So to start things off, what do you all think was different about our collective efforts against the ACP? And, John touched on some of these issues, but why do you think we prevailed when so many others have failed trying to do the same thing? Rick, why don't you start us off?
I'm not sure I can answer that question very well. There are a lot of, we can address why we prevailed. The question of why, say, the Mountain Valley Pipeline continues, I'm going to leave that to somebody else to address. I've heard some good opinions and analysis of that, but I'm just dismayed. I mean, obviously, something corrupt happened there. One of the things that John mentioned was this sort of new level of scrutiny, and that happened on many fronts. I was focused myself on sort of the technical problems and the environmental risk associated with constructing a pipeline across the Central Appalachian Highlands. That's what motivated me. And I had just retired and jumped back in, and sort of in for a penny, in for a pound is my approach to things. And another word for that is obsessive behavior. But I've had some experience in the past dealing with environmental issues, and I've seen the game plan before, the playbook. So first thing to do was, in my opinion, was to really study what their plans are. And they weren't very forthcoming. We had to battle and file FOIAs and lots of back and forth just to get access to the actual construction plans. A lot of people went through the same fight. The Forest Service in in particular held out asking for site-specific plans. How are you going to build a pipeline on a slope this steep with karst at the bottom of the hill, unstable type soils, endangered species in the streams below that without causing harm? And Dominion resisted providing that kind of information. They wanted to instead rely on sort of vague statements that they would, fully comply with the laws, the requirements, that they would go beyond that. Even they would apply best-in-class technology when they ran into problems. What that meant is if one thing didn't work, try another thing. I mean, I'm getting off on a tangent here, and I can be a little bit sarcastic when I'm talking about best-in-class technology. But that's ultimately what they were relying on, and it wasn't really spelled out. It was sort of a menu of options, some of which were quite vague, such as they would apply advanced engineering. Well, I found that pretty annoying, and so some of us dug in and reviewed the application material and studied what the legal requirements were, and saw the ways that Dominion was going to be able to, or the pipeline developers were going to be able to avoid responsibility for the damage they did, or be allowed to go forward and do the damage. There was all kinds of terminology in their application material. They would do things to avoid problems. Very specifically, they would do specific things, except where it wasn't practical to do so. That was sort of the word practical, or practicable was another term they used, just sort of ran through everything they did. They always had an out. If the state law required, if the state regulations required that they not do construction directly in native brook trout streams during the spawning season, then they would get a variance. They would get it in advance of even doing construction, and that variance was designed for emergency situations. They would avoid building. The law required that open trenches for pipelines not be more than, gosh, I forgot the number now, 1,000 feet long, maybe it's 500. But they were going to comply with that, and the DEQ spokesman at one of the hearings indicated they would be required to comply with that. It turns out that they weren't. So over and over again, we saw that there was no actual compliance.
Okay.
And what we did was to conduct this level of scrutiny is we obtained the plans and we georeferenced them, and we put them on online GIS maps that everybody could access. We published them, in other words. And we also put the plans in context: environmental sensitivity, slopes, karst, species, types of streams. So we did that. A lot of people were involved in that. When I say we, I mean there was a lot of people involved. And a lot of,
excuse me, Rick, is that something you've seen anyone else do in all of the other pipeline kind of fights that you've seen across the country, or is that
I've not really seen anybody do this in relation to any environmental issues. I mean, on a detailed scale, there are many sorts of analyses done or assessments done on a very coarse scale, but doing it on a detailed scale, like this hill slope, that trout stream,
that was something new.
No, I hadn't seen that before. So we brought the plans, we had to fight to get them, we got them, we put them in environmental context, and then and then we initiated surveillance, the compliance surveillance initiative, which involved doing aerial photographs of the whole 200 miles we were looking at, and then georeferencing those photographs so you could actually overlay the actual construction plans with the photographs and see where they deviated. We started calling attention to that.
That was definitely something groundbreaking that I think other people don't really get a chance. We had the Pipeline Air Force on our side, which was kind of a new level of citizen engagement.
It definitely was. And the GIS mapping too. I really think assembling information, which is what geographic information is about, and then presenting it to the public in a way that can be accessed. I think that's what we did. We were doing Dominion's work, basically, doing this kind of analysis. They developed.
And I think that was something that John specifically mentioned in his talk, is that the citizens had to get up and do the work that the agencies and the developers wouldn't. What was your perspective on that?
mine?
No, Kent.
Oh, Ken, yes.
He was on the receiving end of Dominion's ire and BS.
Well, I mean, my perspective, I don't know. I kind of had a deer in the headlights feeling for a while when the whole thing first started, because this was not something. Project like this was not something that was within recent experience on our two national forests. So, we were starting from scratch along with just about everybody else, and just the way it was approached, where we found out about the project by reading our local paper. And then, from there it went downhill in terms of when we started having meetings. There was very much an attitude of this is inevitable, and we're looking for a rubber stamp, and there was very much a sense of entitlement there, and that I think set the tone for the whole process, and ultimately led to the project's downfall. I think, they shot themselves in the foot by being arrogant.
And you feel that there was a difference in the way the Forest Service responded, kind of in this instance, to other projects you'd seen in the past?
I think there probably was. Again, at our level, I don't know that any of us had that kind of firsthand experience with this sort of project. So we were kind of approaching it, well, we're supposed to be evaluating it, so we're going to evaluate it. We certainly got signals from higher up in the agency, even very early in the process, that there were some who were looking for it to be just a rubber stamp type exercise, but we didn't approach it that way. And we felt like we were just doing our jobs. It's not that we were anti-pipeline or pro-pipeline, but that's not what our job was. Our job was to evaluate the effects of it, and base our decision on the project on that evaluation of facts and the real impacts of it. So that's what we did for as long as we could.
That's definitely appreciated. We were surprised again and again at how often things got turned back to Dominion because of the forest. I definitely appreciate it. Ernie, how did you find differences in the way the folks in Nelson County and surrounding counties especially kind of fought against this? I'm sure in your roles with Wild Virginia, the County Board of Supervisors, everything else, you've come across development projects people didn't want. What went differently this time?
Well, one of the things that was clear at the very beginning, because at the very beginning, everyone's trying to find, the right way to fight something or stop it, whatever that one thing might have been. And as Jonathan points out so brilliantly, is that it was never one thing. There were so many different fronts, so many things that were wrong, so many things that, were left undone or unsaid. There was many different venues to go at this. And so when you're trying to organize at the very beginning, you get, people thinking that, well, I think I've got the right answer. Well, we all need to get behind this one. And to be able to diversify that and to accentuate the fact that everybody was stronger by leaning as heavily as they can on those things that they feel most strongly about, that was going to work out. You just find the one that you've got the most resources and ability and the most tools to work on, and that's what happened. And that was really important. And the other thing that there was a question about, the difference between the ACP and the MVP fight, is that we had a really great villain in Dominion. Everybody knew Dominion. Nobody really liked them. Everybody loved to hate them for whatever reason. And their inability to do things right, I guess, opened up lots of venues for us to see, like Rick said, if this was going to be done right, how would you do it? And of course, Dominion didn't have the resources to do that at all. Even if they had, they wouldn't have chosen to. So that defined a lot of the strategy for us in terms of doing that. And the pressure that people all over the route in Virginia were able to put on Dominion. Dominion ultimately was the only entity with the ability to pull the plug and make it all stop. And the fact that Dominion was under intense scrutiny, in Richmond, there was a 5-part, study that the local newspaper did, just focusing on all the things that Dominion did and all the things they had their hands into that were maybe a little less than, genuine or benign or benevolent, that put a whole lot of pressure on Dominion. And I think they had to find a way to bow out gracefully. And, and unfortunately, MVP doesn't have a local villain to focus on. And I'm not as up on MVP stuff, so I really can't speak for it. But I know that, ultimately that, the cumulative effects of all of the diverse aspects of our opposition to what was going on, ultimately all pointed towards Dominion. Sure. And that was a big thing for us.
Definitely. A common villain really helps. Dave, Ernie's brought up some good points about MVP. Could you give us a little perspective on, you've been more involved in the MVP fight since the Atlantic Coast Pipeline was canceled, and we're really juggling both all the way through. What do you think on the citizen side, were there significant difference in how these two fights were handled? Obviously, there were things that were outside of the control of the resistance, but what do you think we did differently? I'm meaning the people in those two cases.
Yeah. I guess, first of all, I'll point out the strengths that were on both sides, the opposition on both sides. One of the things Ernie mentioned was, people were looking at the thing that could help us win. And what I saw in both cases is that everybody was coming from different directions and bringing different information and background and motivation. And I almost never saw anybody say to somebody else, that's the wrong direction. Don't go down that road. Everybody, kind of encouraged everybody else. And I think that a lot of the approach and the factors were the same. Ernie's right that we didn't have the same really visible villain in Dominion on MVP. But frankly, by that time in Virginia, they had all become villains because everybody was coming to see, how big and how destructive these things would be. In part, and I won't say this is the only thing, but in part timing, it killed us on MVP because, some of the processes just got going quicker on MVP than on ACP, and the leverage that was built by MVP getting to break more ground and do more work earlier before we could get them stopped through court cases. That was just really, really hard to overcome. The other thing was that, when ACP went down and Constitution went down and others were having all these problems, that obviously just raised the outrage of people like Joe Manchin and others who said, we're not going to let this happen again, and so we were kind of, in a way, on MVP, kind of victims of the fact that there'd been all this success. Now they could bring all their attention to, let's get this one through. We're not going to let these radicals win again. So I think that was, there were, to me, the thing that I'm happy about, the thing that impresses me is that on both sides there was the cooperation, the synergy, the values from so many different directions that got input into them. And you know, the fact that we could not stop MVP in the end wasn't because people didn't do all the best stuff. It was other factors that we just couldn't overcome.
Thank you, Dave. He's brought up a couple points that I want to bring on to you, Lou. I see your video is off. Are you still here with us?
I'm still here.
Excellent. He mentions kind of everyone bringing different skill sets to the table and not discouraging each other to try whatever might stick at the wall. You were in a pretty unique position trying to build a coalition of lots of diverse groups from people of all different backgrounds and hold them together for a long, long time. Obviously, there was a lot of emotion involved in that. There were a lot of different personalities. Issues probably came up of kind of territory and influence. How did you manage to kind of hold all of that together? How did that seem from your perspective?
Well, I think the greatest enemy of a coalition being successful is for people not to know what's going on. And so we made a concerted effort, and it wasn't just me, it was everybody, and we all had the same philosophy of not trying to hold on to information as if it were some kind of a, you know, if I know it and you don't know it, that makes me more important type of attitude. So we had regular communication. We had amongst all of us, we had a mutual trust. And I think that went a long ways to explaining our success. Another element of the success didn't have anything to do with anything we did. It had to do with who we were fighting. Dominion, I think John mentioned, used the word somewhere along the line, ego of Dominion. And that indeed was part of the problem for Dominion. They were so sure that they were right. They honestly believed, I think, or they talked themselves into believing that best in class meant whatever they said was best in class, you know, and et cetera, et cetera. Let me read you one paragraph. John knows what I'm going to read because I pointed this out to him. He has one paragraph on page 51. For those of you who haven't read the book, this capsulizes why Dominion tried to build a pipeline and also why they failed. He says, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline would be a piece of long-lived infrastructure that itself would create a rationale for new long-lived gas power plants. Once in place, the pipeline would help justify even more gas power plants, much in the way suburban owners of new pickup trucks look for excuses to go to Home Depot to buy stuff in need of hauling. John, every time I get in my truck to go to Home Depot, I think of you now. But seriously, what he's done is capture in one paragraph. One of the reasons we succeeded was because our enemy, if you will, or our opposition, that's a better word, believed in themselves to be invincible. And I think that's a word I used, and you quoted me in it, John. And nobody's invincible. And once Dominion began to really think that, and they dealt with the Forest Service in the same way. They, I think, made themselves vulnerable. And if you go back and read, if you read John's book, he goes through all of the court cases, and it's quite obvious that their sense of invincibility was to a large extent their undoing.
Thank you, Lou. John, quick question for you. You obviously did tons and tons of research on kind of the history, present, and future trajectory of fossil fuels in the energy mix, where policy is going. and from what I've read, are pretty good at explaining all that to people. What do you see as far as kind of where that is really headed with the change in, the huge drop in costs in renewables lately, focus on really integrating that into the grid, and the decades and decades of momentum of the fossil fuel industry in the policy space? Like, how do you see that going, and where do you see the kind of the grassroots influence? How do we keep this from happening again in the future? You're muted.
Okay, unmuted. Let me answer that question by backing up a little bit and explaining why I thought it was important to tell two stories in the book. So one is the story of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, right? The whole saga of folks who were opposed to it, how they fought it, Dominion's response, Dominion's rationale for the project, and what played out, between 2014, 2020 on the ground in Virginia. Wrapped around that narrative, I wanted to give readers the larger story of how did we get here? Why was this project proposed in the first place? Right? What are the incentives driving Dominion Energy, Duke Energy, but not just Dominion and Duke, Williams Company, Enbridge, Equitrans Midstream. I mean, a profusion of pipelines, gas power plants, liquefied natural gas export terminals, largely in the Gulf Coast. A decade ago, we were in the midst of a gas infrastructure building boom for which Dominion was the poster child. So, from a narrative perspective, you pointed out, Dominion makes a great foil for the reasons you all pointed out, but Dominion was also all in on natural gas, right? And you could hold them up as Exhibit A of this gas building boom. They had built Cove Point gas export terminal, and they were proposing lots of new gas-fired power plants. And a lot of the capacity on the ACP would go to supply gas power plants owned by Dominion and Duke. A decade later, today, we're still in the midst of a huge gas infrastructure building boom. The core question, is this in the public interest? Do we need it? Still really doesn't get asked. And if you ask me as an climate energy journalist, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've seen a lot of, I don't know, chicanery, whatever you want to call it, shaping of narratives. I'm still shocked by the extent to which that core question never really gets asked or scrutinized in a serious way, despite the years and thousands of pages of agency reviews. That's the thing that surprised me most from reporting this story. The thing that didn't surprise me, when you dig into it and you listen to the earnings calls the CEOs of these companies do for Wall Street analysts, when you read transcripts of their speeches to other gas and utility industry executives, when you see how they talk to each other, it's not surprising that they're seeking to build very profitable, lucrative, pieces of infrastructure on which they are guaranteed a rate of return that you can't really find on Wall Street. That is the rational thing to do if you're the CEO of Dominion Energy. If you don't do it, your board will find someone who will do it. And so I wanted to hold kind of an X-ray up to the incentive structure that is going to keep producing projects of questionable value to the broader public without even factoring in the climate impacts of these projects, which, by the way, really doesn't get factored into a lot of these analyses, believe it or not, to this day. And so, Dan, in answer to your question, I will just say that right now we're in a moment where this question of there's many proposals to build new gas export terminals to ship, liquefy, supercool, ship natural gas from the US abroad. And like pipelines, these will be operating for many decades. The investors behind, they cost $30 billion to build. the investors behind them want to recoup their investment. The question of whether the greenhouse gas emissions of those projects should even really get analyzed when the Department of Energy or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the key agencies that have to say, yeah, this is in the public interest, you should build this, here's your permit. We are in a fight, right now, court fights, but more importantly, public relations fights. And if I'll leave you with one takeaway, to your question, it's like the war for the narrative is very much still underway, right? You could see the case of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline as a story in which the Davids beat Goliath, right? But this larger war that has been going on for many decades to persuade the public and key policymakers, everyone really, investors, that we're gonna have to stay on this natural gas bridge. It's a bridge fuel to a clean energy future. We're gonna have to stay on this bridge for a long time to come. And so that was a part of the story I really wanted to get across in the book, because I really think you can't understand the story of one pipeline fight, as unprecedented as it is and remarkable, a story as it is, without that larger context. And I will just say, sadly, I don't think market forces or solar and wind and batteries getting cheaper is going to solve this on its own, because there's a whole dynamic of companies with enormous political influence not wanting to give up very profitable business models, right? And you see it now with Dominion trying to build gas-fired power plants to supply data centers that use a ton of energy, right? And so there's always going to be a new reason to reach for, to justify lucrative, long-lived, polluting infrastructure.
You bring up a point that is kind of the point of a question, which I think, given the interest of time, we should probably go straight into Q&A. I'm not entirely sure I understand it, but it has to do kind of with incentives, I think, and corporate activists is the term in the question. And does your book discuss kind of how corporations, whether Dominion and Duke on the pro side or any other corporations that could have been considered activists on the resistance side, played any part in the ACP being canceled? Or was it mainly grassroots and environmental organizations?
Well, I hope I succeeded in getting across this sense that the folks who fought it, you held it up long enough for the political winds to shift and for market trends to become more apparent, right? So, to the point that more of the Mountain Valley Pipeline got put in the ground than the ACP and acquired a certain momentum, and a narrative gets built around that as well. The ACP was held up, one of the first reporting trips I did was in early 2019 in Nelson County, and I went to a workshop rally event hosted by Friends of Nelson at Spruce Creek on the Averets property. And I heard Tom Hadwin, who many of you know, talking to people saying Dominion is stunned at getting hung up in the mountains because they had lost the permit. SELC had argued against, the Forest Service, National Park Service permits. They got thrown out. Construction was halted. And so suddenly, every day you're not building a pipeline, you're spending a lot of money, right? You've borrowed a lot of money. Investors are getting nervous. And so there's this, to your question about incentives, on the one hand, if you can get it built, you lock in a 14% guaranteed rate of return on just owning, the capital expenditure of that project. But if you can't get it built, you're leaking money, millions and, eventually billions of dollars over the course of the project. So that maybe won the day, right? In summer 2020, Dominion decides to sell a lot of its gas assets to Warren Buffett, and later divests almost completely from its gas assets. I don't think that happens. I don't think you get Dominion Energy taking out full-page ads in the New York Times and the Washington Post, but 2 months after they cancel the pipeline, touting their offshore wind project that they're going to build, the biggest offshore wind project in the country, and selling all their gas assets. Again, they were all in on gas. That doesn't happen without the citizen resistance. And I don't think you get the Virginia Clean Economy Act that shifted Dominion's incentives quite dramatically when it was passed in the General Assembly in 2020. That basically requires them to have zero carbon electricity portfolio by 2045. I don't think that happens necessarily without the grassroots resistance that their, whether you argue it's their approach to the pipeline or just the inherent flaws of the project. I don't know if that happens without the coalition that formed to fight it.
Excellent. Kent, I've got another question for you. The forest basically did what it could until it couldn't any longer to, hold up this project, not from an ideological perspective, but simply from, as you said, our job is to evaluate this thing. Given that there is still a gas build out and now likely a major kind of transmission build out is going to happen to both support renewables and data centers and everything else going on. From your perspective, do you see any changes to the Forest Service's kind of policy, methodology, whatever, in dealing with these things, or is it really going to depend on who's in office?
Well, I guess I've been out of the Forest Service for 6.5+ years now, so I'm not really up to speed on whether there have been any changes at the top of the agency regarding how these projects are reviewed. Certainly the processes are still in place. As long as the permitting reform push hasn't gone through, those processes are still in place, and I think it's going to be up to the mood at the top of the agency at the time as to how it gets evaluated. When we worked on this, the decision authority was always above the national forest level from the very beginning, but the day-to-day work was done at the national forest level until we basically irritated enough people that they took it away from us. So I don't know. Current chief Randy Moore, I think is I have a lot of respect for him, and I think he would try to be as honest as he possibly could in the review of something like this. But you get a different chief in there, you just don't know. There's so much dependent on the points of view of the chief and the deputies below him. And that's really where we kind of got crossways, was with some of the deputies below the chief level who really wanted us to stop creating headaches for them.
Thank you.
So I don't know. I guess my answer is kind of a non-answer. It really depends on the personalities in the agency, and of course, as you said, the administration is going to set the tone for what gets done. Certainly these kinds of decisions are not typically made at the administration level, but those political appointees are going to kind of set the tone for how the agency reviews things.
Well, thank you, Ken.
Yep.
Ernie, I got a question for you. You're still involved kind of in the county level administration and one of the kind of the hotbeds of the resistance. Looking toward the future for your county, what have you noticed, if anything, that has changed in kind of how the business gets done, how the citizens interact and or participate? Have you noticed anything persistent since the ACP fight?
Well, in Nelson County, the biggest change we've had is we have a county administrator that believes that it's the role of the government to be in contact with people in the community, and the work that's done in the community by, you know, volunteers, agencies, nonprofits, and such. That's pretty groundbreaking in Nelson County from what we had when the ACP was first proposed, and even when it was defeated. You know, for us, having a woman in charge is an important thing, and the fact that there's a lot of respect for the community and the work that's done in the community that's not done directly by the county administration is, you know, bodes well for the future, I think.
Thank you. John, it appears I didn't ask a question correctly. And it looks like the actual question was, does your book include the Dominion shareholder activism that was related to perhaps influencing them throughout the journey or toward the end especially?
Yeah, not a whole lot. And I was aware of it. And I described one or two shareholder meetings, people's accounts of them. But absolutely, there's a, you know, persistent strain of activism and a lot of organizations involved in the boardroom, you know, targeting decision makers in the boardroom, getting resolutions, a lot of them having to do with you know, corporate commitments to net zero and methane emissions. And so that was one of the things that I thought about writing more about that. And my editor, man, God bless her. I'm very grateful to her. I had like several other chapters, and that would have been part of one of them that were left on the cutting room floor. And there are many people, many organizations, many elements of, you know, the fight against this project that I, you know, just couldn't fit in. And so I wound up choosing those elements and those characters who I thought could serve as a proxy for the anonymous thousands and dozens of other organizations that were involved. But it meant some painful choices. But I do think that that is, you know, the investor activism, it may not always result in very clear, tangible outcomes. It's really hard to change that boardroom culture, I think, especially in the oil and gas and utility sectors. That's not to say they don't have an impact. So.
All right, thank you. I think we're going to run on past our initial Q&A time, which is fine as long as people want to stay on. Certainly a couple things I'd still like to ask. Dave, what has changed for your organization, for Wild Virginia, since the ACP fight? Obviously, I imagine you all made a whole bunch of new connections and, you know, allies, and perhaps find yourselves focusing on a number of other issues that you may not have before. How is it different for you now?
Well, I think the theme of what we do is the same, in that what we focus most heavily on is trying to get those agencies and officials who are supposed to work for us to actually do that. We've done that for decades, whether it is, you know, a federal agency or a state agency. A lot of times we focus very heavily on the state because, like I was saying with other things, that's our lane. That's what we've chosen to try to be effective in a lot of ways. What the pipeline fights did is inform people of something I've known for a little over 40 years now, being in this field, and that is that if you're not pushing agencies, then you're not going to get the right decisions. And it's not necessary. I don't even ascribe, motives to the decisions they make or don't make. It's in part it's inertia, in part it's habit, in part it's timidity, and in part it is pressure from above, not to make decisions that are going to make somebody powerful and rich unhappy. But what it did do, like I say, it informed a lot of people. I don't remember. I can't say how many people said to me, well, you know what? I thought these people were working for us. I thought they were protecting us. And then they got disenchanted. Now, I will quickly say, having been an agency person in Virginia for a long time, that what I'm talking about is not the kind of guys who we're seeing right here, who are down in the agencies, who are trying to do their jobs, who understand what their responsibilities are. It's the people who kind of bring the weight down on those scientists and those engineers and those folks who are trying to do policy the way it's supposed to be. But what we're focusing on very heavily in Wild Virginia is taking a lot of that energy and a lot of that interest and a lot of that knowledge and putting it into things like fighting pollution from PFAS, toxic chemicals, fighting to try to get the rules that allowed these pipelines to be approved by Virginia to be tightened up and changed, and the laws actually enforced. For example, how you do construction. This is the biggest, MVP has been the biggest damage from construction that we've ever seen, probably since the interstate was built in Virginia, certainly in my lifetime. But we have more than 6,000 construction sites going on around the state right now that are being held to no more stringent, some in most cases much less stringent requirements than the pipelines. And so what we want to do, I love the history, I love learning what happened, but what I want to do is use it as a spur to go forward, and that's what we're trying to do. And what I know now is that when I start to explain these things, especially on the state level of what's happening, what they're not doing, is that I can very easily get dozens of people to join us and to put their voices in there too. So that's what makes me happy. That's what motivates me to keep down that track.
Excellent. Thank you. One last question for John, and then I'm going to offer you guys each a 30-second parting shot if you want. We're starting to lose participants and probably time to let people move on. Let's see. John, does your book address how we can pressure FERC to actually assess public convenience and necessity moving forward?
I get into that a bit at the end. And, the end of the book actually focuses on the Mountain Valley Pipeline. So I think there's maybe 1 or 2 chapters that happen after the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is canceled in 2020. And it's kind of like, what do you do now? With that energy that you have all generated is one of the questions I was interested in. But also to this point about this larger, the momentum of this gas build out and this question of how many of these projects really get scrutinized, cost, benefits, risks, economic, environmental, local economic impacts, property owners, businesses, all the things that FERC is supposed to weigh when they determine whether to give a given pipeline or gas export terminal that certificate of public convenience and necessity. The answer is not very hopeful, because what happened, and it's in the last chapter and more has happened since then, FERC was on the cusp of reforming itself somewhat. by which I mean the process that it follows to the internal guidelines for weighing those costs and benefits for a pipeline. They were about to update it for the first time since 1999. And then a week or two later, Russia invaded Ukraine. And Senator Joe Manchin hauled the chair of FERC before his committee in the Senate and piled on. And within days, FERC had retracted this policy update that had been in the works for years, that was broadly supported by independent experts as a sensible thing to do. More landowner participation, more channels to get the public, their concerns and comments folded into this process, environmental justice concerns, and of course, climate impacts, downstream emissions. When you build something like this, should FERC have to study the likely downstream greenhouse gas emissions from building a pipeline? All of that got pulled back very suddenly. And that's off the table. So the question now is, will the law that gives FERC the power to give eminent domain to a Dominion Energy to permit these projects, the Natural Gas Act from 1938, will that get updated? In the current congressional environment, seems unlikely. But I think there is, some consensus among folks who've lived with these projects and their allies that there is need to reform the process by which the federal regulators deem them to be in the public interest or not. And, FERC, the last thing I'll say is, as a freelance journalist, I'm always pitching stories to editors. And I can't tell you how many times I've pitched the story with the headline, FERC is the most important overlooked climate actor, in the federal government. Let's talk about FERC. And I've never met an editor that wants to assign a story about FERC because it sounds pretty boring. And it is kind of boring, but it's important. And so one good outcome from all this is more people know what FERC is, and they know how consequential FERC's decisions are. And so we'll see what comes of that.
Okay. One last little question. Do you think the demand for natural gas is growing because of export possibilities to NATO and other allies, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Or is it a lot of it up to Joe Manchin throwing his weight around as soon as that happened?
Well, demand, so I'm assuming you're talking about demand for exporting U.S.
Exporting LNG,
right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of debate around this. And when you talk to experts, and I've interviewed energy researchers at different think tanks and universities, and there really is, it's up for grabs. But to me, that signals that the question needs more study. Mm-hmm. In a way, you're looking into a crystal ball, and you're saying, what will Vietnam and India and all these countries that need to supply more energy to their citizens and their industries, what future are they gonna go for? Is it one in which there's more renewables or gas for decades to come, US gas, assuming it's gonna be cheap and there won't be regulations and policy measures to, maybe for climate reasons, or maybe because it drives up domestic prices. When you export natural gas to other countries, Americans pay more for natural gas. All of that stuff is hard to predict. Europe has done an amazing job of weaning themselves off of natural gas in the last 2 years. They've gone farther than they thought they could. So in a way, you have a war between these companies that want to build these projects, and they're saying, we need them because India is going to burn a lot of coal unless we build it and give them our gas. Versus people saying, well, there could be another future in which India decides to build out a huge amount of solar energy and, subsidize that. And the answer is nobody really knows which future we're heading for, but policy will influence it, right? Mm-hmm. Decisions getting made right now And I'm a big believer that the thing that gets overlooked in this whole conversation, and it's part of why I wrote this, the political economy. Like, you build a pipeline, you build a gas export terminal, that's not just a piece of infrastructure. It exerts a whole political force field around it. The companies that build them turn that economic power into political power. And they do it to protect their legacy businesses. That's how they operate. I don't know why we should be surprised that any company that's going to build a pipeline or a gas export terminal is not going to want to shut it down decades before the end of its useful life. And so those kinds of questions to me get kind of skated past in a lot of the discourse. And I was really keen in this book to try to center them a little more, because they're just going to keep coming up again and again. You know, the more we try to pretend that they aren't at the heart of what we're talking about. When we talk about, is there demand for gas? I mean, maybe, but that is downstream of certain policy decisions, right? Mm-hmm. That shapes outcomes. And grassroots activism shapes policy decisions, right?
So once again, we come back to our superpowers, and not to forget we have them, and to, you know, especially in the coming months and years, exercise them with our local, state, federal representatives, et cetera, because it does have an effect, as we see based on the subject of your book. I think it's time to wrap things up. 30-second parting shots. Lou, what are your thoughts on the book and where we're headed, or just anything? You're muted.
There we go. I think it's an excellent book, John. You've captured the spirit of the opposition, as well as the complications of the process. You know, describing FERC, describing the economics. It's a great balance. I think you've made you and your editor. I don't know what was on the cutting room floor, but the result was great choices were made, and congratulations.
Great, thank you. Ken?
Well, I'd just say, you know, whatever the project is that's coming down the pike, a little advice would be to make sure you know what all the review processes are, and what the responsibilities of the agencies are in those review processes, what information they're supposed to be relying upon, and make sure they're actually doing that, and call them when they're not, because I mean, basically that's what prevailed in this situation, is the constant calling the agencies when they weren't doing what they were supposed to do according to their own regs, and that delay just cost too much. So that's what it boiled down to, and you know, whatever the next big project is, the processes are likely to be different. So it's definitely going to be something that you'll need to educate yourselves on at the time.
All right, well, that absolutely leads me next to Rick.
Well, I would echo what he just said. We need to really look at the plans and scrutinize them carefully, make sure they're compliant. We really have to step up our game. We don't know what's coming next. And if we were to face Dominion, Dominion would be a lot smarter than it was last time around. We built our GIS online mapping system from scratch. We've got it in place now. We're working on a lot of different projects. This is ABRA and the Conservancy and other groups. We plan to maintain that. So in terms of stepping up our game, I think we have. And I don't think we're going to be, I think we'll be successful if we have to face other things, as long as we're ready to step up and deal with them.
All right, thank you. Ernie?
I want to thank John so much for giving us another tool in our tool belt going forward. And, you know, already, you know, in Nelson County, all the members of the Board of Supervisors and people in our planning department have copies of the book. So, you know, they can put that to work going forward. And Nelson, we're still trying to get the easements vacated. There's over 100 people in Nelson that still don't have full ownership of their property because of the easements that are still in place. We're still trying to get those done. But we have the county being an advocate to try to make that happen instead of being, you know, a stand apart, you know, faction from the rest of the community or the people that are working on it. So, so John, thank you for, you know, making it possible for us to do that.
And Dave Sly.
I'll just kind of rephrase what a couple of people said, and that is keep showing up when it's in your backyard, when it's in your community, when it's going to affect your interest and your values. Learn what you can about the process and play your role, and hold them to those promises we made each other when we came up with the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and the Endangered Species Act. Those are the things that are supposed to represent our values, and we just have to keep fighting for them.
All right. Well, I think that about does it for us today. John, thank you so much. Lou, Dave, Ernie, Kent, Rick, thank you all for being here and offering us your time on this. Also like to thank West Virginia Highlands Conservancy for kind of putting this together and hosting it with us. And remember, you can reach both the Highlands Conservancy and Abra at our websites online. And I will put those links in right there. If you like the work we're doing and you'd like to help support us, there's a way to donate there online. Once again, Island Press is offering a 30% discount on Gaslight using the webinar promo code. And I'd just like to thank John again for writing a fantastic book. And thanks for giving us a different perspective on it. It was, that in and of itself was really informative. And it was great to go look back, look around, and keep looking for the future. So for all of you who joined us, thanks for your time. Stay alert, stay in the fight, and remember, you have superpowers. You are all the reason we're here today. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much.